So I get asked a lot how to mount these 30 series torque converters backwards, or instead of facing this way, facing the opposite way. This is normally how I run my torque converter on my drift cart here. And it's actually pretty simple. So we'll go over that and just a couple of tips on these 30 series torque converters. Now this is a eBay torque converter. I got it for like 60 bucks. The price has went up since I bought it. They usually run about 80-90 bucks now, but for the price, you can't beat these torque converters. I've got 2 of them, and I've put them through all kinds of abuse, and they're still holding up great. Now this one I had off because the bearings had went out in the shaft here, but bearings are super cheap. They're $1 a piece, and they only went out because I was running the chain way too tight. So that was my fault. It wasn't anything to do with the torque converter itself or the bearings. I had a broken sprocket that I was running, and it would make the chain pop and it would just act sporadic. So instead of actually fixing it, I just made it even tighter, and that eventually wore that bearing out. But of course we got a new sprocket, it's not cracked, and new bearings, so we're going to put it back on. All right, so we'll start by mounting the backing plate. Now you can put this in really any orientation you can get it to fit. Most people run it like this, it mounts up under the engine, but for this application, just so I have enough clearance for the wheel, I have to mount it front ways. So just got to find the set of bolt holes that match up with the pattern on the engine. All right, next we want to put our driven pulley on. So, you know, I've got some other videos where I changed the spring here, and what this spring does is, this is a stiffer spring. Normally these come with a red or a green spring, but this is a yellow spring, but it's just a heavier spring. So this torque converter engages at a higher RPM. So the engine gets up higher speed, and it actually makes quite a bit of difference. And I've got videos on that, on how to install that and some of the difference it makes. There's also some spring settings you can change that these torque converters come with. Essentially, if you have the holes down, this is 1, 2, 3, and it goes in order. This is the, you know, lowest RPM engagement, and that's the second highest RPM engagement, and this is the highest RPM engagement. Essentially determines the amount of RPM you have when this thing starts adjusting the gear ratios. But as you can see, I've got it set in the highest setting, and you can also change your sprockets here. Now this is a 12 tooth 35 chain sprocket. I do have a 10 tooth 35 chain sprocket, and it substantially increases the amount of torque, but you don't get a lot of speed out of it. So got quite a bit of extra torque, but it took away the amount of speed I could get. So for this setup with the 78 tooth axle sprocket and 12 tooth sprocket here, works the best for me. So we'll put our pulley on. Make sure you got the keyway lined up. Alright, so there's our washer. Now the key with this nut, you know, this is a lock nut. You don't want to tighten it down until it doesn't go anymore, because that puts pressure on the bearings, and it restricts this pulley some. It doesn't turn as freely. And I know a lot of people do that, but that's going to take away some of your power because the engine's going to have to overcome that extra resistance. So you want to tighten it down, make sure it's tight and not going to come off, but you still want this to be free spinning. Now, if you tighten it too much, you'll get some resistance and it won't spin like that. All right, so next we need to get the backing plate on the shaft here. It does come with a thick spacer. You have to put that on, but to get the backing plate lined up with our pulley here, I'll have to add a spacer with mine. And so we're gonna put a extra little spacer there. And this does have a keyway, so line it up with the key on the shaft. And it also comes with a little bushing so the belt can freely kind of ride on the plate here when it's idling. So we'll put that on as well. All right, so the main thing the main issue with mounting the torque converter essentially backwards is that the chain rubs the fins that come as part of the casting. So what you have to do is you have to take a grinder and grind these fins off here to allow for the chain to pass. So that's really the trick to it. And you know, I've done it on both of my torque converters, and taking these fins off hasn't affected it structurally. I mean, the backing plates are still great. I've put many miles on it. You know, this is the torque converter that I use to do all the wheelies, so structurally it's still sound. Now, compared to the chain, this metal is pretty soft. So I have allowed the chain, you know, I ground off as much as I could and thought I had clearance, but still the chain had ground off the rest of it. So the chain kind of clearances itself, and it'll take off what it needs to. And it hasn't affected the chain or anything like that, because this metal is, like I said, pretty soft. So key thing before you put the rest on here is to go ahead and get your belt on. It'll make it a whole lot easier. Now this belt is a little old and worn out, but that's all I got for right now. So as you can see, the belt actually isn't flat on both sides. So this side is flat, but this side here is tapered. Now you want the tapered side to go along with the taper of the two faces here. So, and as you can see, the backing plates on both of these are flat, so you want flat on flat, taper on taper. All right, so now we're gonna add our driver here. It has a little collar that goes inside of it, or a little shaft that goes inside of it. Okay, it locks in there. It does have a keyway that'll line up with the keyway on the crank. They come with a little cap. Now this does stick off the crank quite a bit, so you do need a long bolt to get in there. And then you just need to tighten the bolt down. Now impact works great for this. It's really hard to get these bolts tight and loosen them up without an impact because the engine wants to spin over. So So that's it, it's on. They do come with a cover. The covers do have to be cut though. So, you know, this is the cover it comes with. They do have to be cut to make room for the chain. I personally think this cover's ugly. So, and I like the look of this. It looks interesting. So I cut the cover down just so it has some protection, because what this cover does do is in the rain, it keeps the belt from getting wet. Because if this belt gets wet, then you have no friction and your cart's not going to go anywhere if it gets super wet. So the cover is good for that, but I like mine like this because I don't run this in the rain too often, and it just protects my arm from inadvertently hitting this. And you can still see the pulley set up, and it still looks cool. So that's essentially what it looks like with the cover cut like that. Now it's time to get the chain on. But I'm going to take this cover back off so we can get the chain in a little easier. All right, so the chain's on. You can see how close it is to those fins there, but it's pretty much made its own path. And we've got the torque converter on backwards. And you can see how close the clearance is between this wheel and the torque converter here. So if you have a side mounted engine, this is a problem that, you know, I've run into quite a bit with my other go-kart as well. But so on this one, I had to raise the engine up. So that's a possible solution if you're running into the same issue. And one other option to mount these torque converters is in this fashion. So this is the cart I just did the live axle swap on, and I didn't have a whole lot of room to mount it frontwards because, you know, the suspension flexes and I would have hit the back of the seat, and I couldn't mount it backwards because this would have got in way of the wheel. And you see we have super tight clearance there. It's actually been rubbing the wheel some, but I already pulled the wheel back out. And the reason I can't move the engine any farther over is because we have our suspension right here in the center. Now, a way to fix this would be to, you know, I could relocate the suspension, put a shock on each side and center the engine, but this is how it is for right now. But what I had to do to mount it this way was, as you can see, I mean, the plate would be almost right up against the exhaust. I've had this exhaust and luckily it comes up and out, but I did grind a little bit off of the plate to thin it out. This exhaust does not touch this plate, but just to keep any heat from, since it's so close, from getting into the backing plate, I put some heat shield between it. And also I had to grind down the fins a little bit on the head. So this is probably something most of y'all aren't wanting to do, but it was just a small amount and it tucks right up in there. The gas tank lip was also in the way a little bit, so I just took a hammer, bent it up a little bit, and I had to grind some of the casting fins off of the backing plate here, but it fits right in there snug, and I like this placement a lot. And all the original mounting hardware for the gas tank is still there and still works. and I got the clearance I was wanting. And the bearing size for these eBay torque converters is 6003 2RS. Now the RS just stands for rubber, but it's a 6003. And these were like, I got a box of them off Amazon for $10.